Hey guys, Brian here from Starlite Pulp, executive editor, and welcome. Thanks for coming into the Pulpcast today. Today we're going to talk about Starlite Pulp review number 5. This is the brand new review, and we've got it features 14 authors of all over the pulp umbrella, everything from horror to sci-fi to crime fiction, detective fiction, as well as some westerns as well in here for sure. So we've got a bunch of authors with us here today, and what we're going to do is talk a little bit about the review. Look forward to hanging out with everybody, and we'll go ahead and get started here. So first off, let's go ahead and start with I think we'll start with Chris Brady and Necropolis. So Chris, first off, for those that haven't read the review yet or haven't seen it, this is certainly the first pulp story I've ever received having anything to do with ancient Rome. So, why don't you talk a little bit about where the idea came from? Is that something that you do regularly in terms of that time period and locale, or is that kind of a unique thing and just where the story came from?
Sure. So I read a lot of history. I also teach history at a college here in Nebraska. And oftentimes when I read history, I find it quite boring. And oftentimes it's elevated too. So like a subject like ancient Rome, it's like just aggregate people that are aloof or what have you. So I wanted to try to mess with it because I highly doubt that that's accurate. Like, I bet you there is some shady Roman out in front of the Colosseum, like working an angle, like, scratching his balls or something like that. So you don't get that in all the secondary sources. So I was reading this book called Rubicon by a narrative historian named Tom Holland, and it talked about these necropolises that were outside of Rome and how they became kind of outcast communities. So in my noggin, I started figuring about what kind of folks would be stranded out there and what would happen if, let's just say, an army convoy was freighting some gold through that community, and then what would happen. So that was the genesis of it. That was the germ, the seed. And then a lot of it, just these ideas from like my personal life kind of popped into it. Like I have these nasty ass cats in that story, but they're based off similar cats that were on my uncle's farm in Iowa that was just overrun by these feral, nasty cats. So it'd be kind of fun to put them in the story too. So you get a little bit of myself, a little bit of history, and hopefully it's just a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the fact, by the way, thank you so much for being a history teacher because because when you get a story like this, I the some of the best way to put it, I guess, kind of contextual things that are built in without me having to do a lot of research. You just kind of assume that they're correct. So
Yeah.
so I certainly appreciate the fact that you are a history professor and I can lean on that. And what about you guys? Have any of the authors here have you guys ever seen or read a pulpish kind of tale from that time period?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
The only
Absolutely
thing that
not.
comes to mind is I read this novel called Killer by it was co-written by Carl Edward Wagner and David Drake, and it's about it's kind of about like a reptilian alien that this Roman hunter is trying to track down so he can bring it to the Colosseum to participate in a game. But that's other than this,
Interesting.
that's the only one I've heard of.
Okay.
There was something years ago called like the Casca series, I think, that was Casca, I guess, was correct me, you'll know far better than I, Christopher, but the guard who stood vigil over Jesus on the cross or
Mhm.
something. But it was like a time travel horror mystery serial killer story where he was the angel of vengeance throughout history. So not quite the same, but pulpy and yeah.
That was written by the dude who Barry Sadler, who wrote Ballad of Green Berets, by the
No
way.
shit, I did not know that. Okay.
Excellent.
All right.
All right, good. Well, thanks, Chris. And by the way, anybody that's watching, Chris's Instagram handle is Gold Medal Book Blog. So I know a lot of you guys follow him, and and get stuff from him. And when I originally I hadn't put the pieces together, right? Like I didn't know Chris was gold. You know what I mean? But because the names were different. So, anyways, if you don't follow, go ahead and give Chris a follow on that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brian.
Absolutely, man. Of course. So let's go to let's go ahead and go to Connor actually with the entomologist. Now, Connor, the entomologist, this is one where this is one of those like pseudo westerns. I think we have a few of them in this novel, and I don't mean pseudo to minimize it. What I mean is it's like a western hybrid because oftentimes when we hear the word western, automatically our brain goes to Louis L'Amour, Clint Eastwood, John Wayne, right? Like something along those lines. And whereas the westerns in this tend not to be very much like that at all.
Yeah,
You know?
this is like more inspired by like Joe Lansdale in
Sure.
his Western writing. You have to forgive me because I'm getting over some crudiness, so I'm sorry if I sound congested. But this story is about a young man in the West in the late 19th century, and he collects bugs, and he's interested in insects, and he has a basically like a cabinet of curiosities that he has on display in this general store in Trinidad, Colorado. And he's unconventional. He's not really like a Western character type. And this cowboy comes into the store who's very rough around the edges, and they have an interaction. And I don't want to give away too much, but it is kind of a weird Western or a like a Western horror story. And the seed for this story was planted several years ago. I just had this scene in my head of an old West duel, and the bad guy goes to draw his pistol, and there's a giant tarantula sitting on the gun, and it freaks him out. And I thought, oh, that's a good image. I should build a story around that. And I kind of let it sit on the back burner. And then maybe about a year ago, I heard about this tarantula festival up in southern Colorado. I live in New Mexico, but in La Junta, Colorado, there's a lot of tarantulas there, and they migrate during mating season. And it kind of reignited this interest in insects and the West. And when I returned to this idea, I thought, I'd like to do something like with an unconventional protagonist, like a Western character who's either like a tinkerer or an inventor or doctor or like a scientist. And when I sat down to write it, this young protagonist came out. The protagonist is a boy who's very precocious, very articulate, intellectually curious, and he's a fish out of water in the West. He wants to go back to the East Coast. Actually wants to go to Harvard to study formally, biology. And there was one story, like when I sometimes when I'm writing, I'll have like I call it like kind of like a security blanket story or novel that I kind of refer to and think about. And for this, there's a story called Tedford and the Megalodon, which was written by Jim Shepard, and it's a really great pulp story. And it's about a guy hunting a megalodon in the 1920s in the Antarctic, and it has this. It really gets into this sort of the psychological depth and motivation of the character. And as I was writing my character, I kept thinking back to that story and trying to kind of dig in and give him some dimensions and explore the motivation for why someone might be interested in this sort of thing in this context. And that was just one of the things I focused on when I was writing this. But I'm so happy that you guys published it, and it's really an honor to be included in this. And thank you. It made my year. So thanks.
I appreciate that. But yeah, I grabbed onto this one right away. When I read it, there was something about it that just kind of struck me. right? And it might have been the younger, the boy protagonist in it. But it was a Western, but it was it's set in the West, right? But it could be anywhere else too. That's the thing. And I really liked that about it, just like from the get-go. And I liked the end of it as well. But certainly not going to spoil anything there. But the point is that this is one that right away when I read it, I thought, okay, yeah, this is I got to find a place for this somewhere. I just don't know where yet. And as the issues are coming together, it's strange because you kind of there's never there's never ever a quota. There's never a I want so many of this kind of story. I want so many mysteries. I want not at all. But at the same time, I also don't want, 10 crime fiction and one of everything else. You know what I mean? But this was one right away where I was like, okay, yeah, I gotta find a spot for this. So yeah, man, thank you so much and appreciate it.
No, it pleases me to no end to hear you say that. So thank you.
Of course. Okay, let's go to you know, um, how about let's go to Eric with Clicker Hill. Now, let me say a couple things. This is another kind of hybrid Western, right? This is very much a Western. It just includes androids. So it all of a sudden it kind of becomes a sci-fi story, right? But it's very much a Western mystery, really, right? It's a Western detective story
Yeah.
with an
So
android. Uh,
right.
so,
Um,
but that and one thing I want to throw in, Eric, is it was pretty long. It's the longest story in the bunch, and I want to say it's somewhere in the 40 45
47.
pages, and it's pretty lengthy. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about the story, where it came from, and anything else you want to talk about it?
Yeah, yeah, sure. So no, I mean, and you're right. It was pretty long. It was one of those stories that I have to admit. So I was still working night shift as a labor and delivery nurse when I wrote this, and it was a slow night. So I had I could do whatever I wanted, and it was one of those stories that it just flowed. It was pure magic in terms of like I had the idea. I start. Here's a scene. Cool. What's the most important thing to happen next? Here. What's the most important thing to happen next? Go here. That kind of thing. So I was very lucky that it went. I apologize it was so long, but I thank you again for publishing it. And it's a sharp contrast from my first story, Bessie Lou's First Dance, in the first review, which was like 16 pages, I think. Um, the idea for this one came from two places distinctly. One, I was walking my toddler son down by the train station that we live near, and I was listening to music while I was walking him, and I just got a seedling of an idea of like, oh, what if I have a story about a detective, and it seems as though a girl has been murdered, and let's solve it. But I was like, okay, that's very basic. Let's build on that. I know that I can do something more, and I am working on my own novel that is more of a straight story. But because this was a short story, I was like, I gotta add a little bit of seasoning to that. So I was like, okay, cool. Let's make it a sci-fi. Let's make it rooted in Western so it feels comfortable, and then start throwing weird things at people. Like for example, and this isn't a spoiler because it's only a few pages in, the tricondylates being kind of in this case kind of a stand-in for like the Native American people, a marginalized, but you get the sense that it wasn't like they just submitted to subjugation. This was sort of on their own terms. And then that's where the title comes from because they call them clickers because the way they speak is a very like trilly kind of sound. So the town offensively is called Clicker Hill. And then the other source of information, inspiration I got was I finally got to reading. So I had read The Maltese Falcon, and there is my own Maltese Falcon right there.
Oh, yeah.
And then I got an omnibus of Dashiell Hammett's the rest of his stuff, and the first one was Red Harvest, I think it's called. Very interesting to read because he didn't write them in the same style or not in like a super similar style. The way that he would condense dialogue, where instead of saying like, and then Billy said blah blah blah, he would just go, Billy said blop, but in narration. He wouldn't quote a lot of things. He'd be like, oh, I filled them in on this. He wouldn't go, hey man, this is what happened to me, blah blah blah. And I really liked that because it gave it a very clipped tight feel, a lot of dry wit to his writing there. So I was super inspired, and I was kind of trying to ape it a little bit. So, but then that inspired me to be like, okay, well then if that's the way that's written, and narration is typically from the main characters, not necessarily inside their head, but always like kind of from their general perspectives, because we're not switching perspectives. Why doesn't my main character have that very clipped, terse kind of perspective? Like that's the way he talks, it's the way he sees things, and that naturally fed into the contrast to all the people around him who are like yeehaw kind of Western simple folk. It was an easy contrast, and then that directly fed into the okay, well, who is this character? That is I wrote it as sort of a twist that has really no impact on the mystery itself, but one that I hope readers that as they go through it go, hang on, oh wait, oh got it, okay. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
that's where Clicker Hill came from.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm an enormous fan, by the way, of the Continental Op and the Red Harvest stuff. It's actually my favorite stuff that Hammett wrote personally. Um, so yeah, and I get some of that, and everything, all the language, the linguistics in general from the android in this are very clipped. They're very to the point, right? Um, so yeah,
Classic, like hard boiled type, you know?
yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, and I like Clicker Hill a lot. It's a lot of fun. So thank you so much, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you for publishing it. It's the last story in the book, so that's kind of awesome for me going from where I was to now. And thank you so much for publishing, and cheers to all you guys for being in the same issue with me. That's awesome.
Awesome, Eric. Thank you. Uh, so I got to go to Gabe next because Gabe's on his break and we all know it. So Gabe, let's talk let's talk to Fisherman. Okay. You sent the Fisherman. I talked to you, I think either shortly before or right after, one of the two, that you had submitted it, and you've been in the review before. Gabriel and I are familiar with each other's work. We both write poetry as well. He also, by the way, has a band. His new record is being reissued called The Starvations. Am I correct on that, Gabe?
Yeah, we're actually like that was from 20 years ago. It was my
Yeah.
band when I was like a teenager into my 20s. It was kind of like my cowpunk kind of band. But yeah.
And that but it hadn't and I'm just making up words here, okay? I'm just saying things. But I think that it hadn't been available for streaming and things like that in the past, and so all of a sudden it is. And they're called The Starvations. The first single was called Red Wine, and it's a lot of fun. So if you guys have streaming services, pick it up. And that's Gabriel Hart. He is the singer, by the way. So anyways, Gabriel, this one, The Fisherman, it takes place on the Salton Sea, and that's a place I think that's near and dear to both of our hearts. It's out here in Southern California. It's a very strange place. It smells horrible, horrible. You can smell it for 10 miles around. It's just a horrible smelling place. And it really has kind of festered. It was like this one-time vacation resort area back in the 50s and especially the 60s.
My dad used to go on vacations there when he was a kid. Yeah.
So did my mom. Yeah. So but it was also a Sinatra Rat Pack kind of joint too for at least a few years. And then it just kind of took a sideways turn and people haven't taken care of it. It's a man-made sea, but funny enough, it's become very important to the wildlife, especially the birds. So they're talking about removing it, but they can't really remove it because they'll all these species of birds will end up getting impacted and hurt. But your story here, The Fisherman, has to do with obviously a fisherman, but as well as two boys, right? And it's a lot of fun, but it also deals with a little bit of the background and history of the Salton Sea. So why don't you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, and thanks everyone for bearing with me. It's just this kind of weird day working, but yeah. So I wrote this story originally. It was actually supposed to be for this Clash Books was going to put out like kind of a coming of age horror anthology, and the whole project kind of fell through. And I wrote this story specifically for it, and I just I forgot about it, and then I'm just all like, wait a second, whatever happened to that story? And so when I saw that your subs were up, I went back to it and I cleaned it up, and I was really just grateful for the opportunity to revisit it. But yeah, so the Salton Sea, for those who don't know, yeah, it's just like an ecological disaster here in the desert. There's nothing they can do about it. The salinity levels basically got so bad from agricultural runoff, and then the pollution from the new river that actually flows north from Mexico, where all the basically all the factories, all the waste from all the factories is being emptied into it. So this lake that's so huge you can't even see the end of it is just like this churning cesspool. But the wildlife has both adapted to it and just kind of not. It's crazy. It looks like the cover of like a black metal record or something, because you see birds kind of diving into the water, and then you just see the decay of life. Like you basically see these tilapia fishes with their eyes plucked out, and that's what the birds are having for their like appetizers. And then you just see the bodies of fish just decaying onto shore, and then you realize what you're stepping on. This coarse pebbly sand is actually all fish vertebrae. Tilapia, they reproduce really quick, and they're just dying very fast too. So it's a really sad and terrifying, but also really fascinating phenomenon. And I thought it was great for just kind of like a cool like ecological kind of horror story. Basically, there's the pollution has just created this almost like, there's like a rat king. It's like all these rats kind of tied together by their tails. It's sort of like a fish version of like a rat king.
Right. Yeah, no, I get that. And the Salton Sea really is a trip, because it started out to be, like I said, a big resort area, and now it's essentially it's a beach ghost town that you can smell from 5 miles away.
Oh yeah, on a hot day, like Brian, I'm sure like in the summer, that smell, actually you can see the smell. It turns into this kind of marine layer miasma, and it floats through. I remember being in La Quinta and smelling it all the way from there, and that's like a half hour away.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so and in the Fisherman, so where did the idea of the actual Fisherman come from? Because the two boys, we understand their motivations pretty early on, I think. But the Fisherman himself, who's a little bit of a horror figure in here, without trying to ruin anything. Where did he come from?
I wish I could tell you. It's it was one of those stories that kind of just dropped into my head fully formed once I gave myself some time. And yeah, there's also I've been calling it a horror opera, because there's this opera element to it. With the kids' grandma used to sing opera at the opera house in this near Bombay Beach in the Salton Sea, and I kind of wanted to. That kind of captured my imagination. So there's these lyrics from the Flying Dutchman kind of weaving through this story, and it's the lyrics are really fucked up. It's almost like conjuring this sort of like otherworldly demon into the story. So that kind of alludes to this weird creature that's been formed in the Salton Sea. That's sort of like this big elephant in the room. Yeah, so that to me, that the grandma singing these like arias is like actually the most frightening part of the story to me.
Absolutely. Okay. Very cool. Well, thank you for that. And Gabe, appreciate you submitting, and appreciate you having you in this, and of course, always welcome in the future. But if you need to get back to work or whatever, you just come and go however you need to. All right.
All right. Thanks so much, and thank you for having my story and for having me today. It's good to see everyone.
All right. So let's go over to let's go over to Ron Clyburn, and so I want to start this off, because this one really cracked me up, because this story I just thought was hilarious. I laughed out loud probably 3 or 4 times over the course of this story. On the other hand, I was telling my son this. Uh, if you had told me a year ago I was going to be publishing a story about a down on his luck PI that speaks telepathically with animals, I'd have run from the room. but but I mean this story just cracked me up, man. The character is there's anytime you have a down on his luck semi-alcoholic PI, there's a little bit of course there's going to be a chance of a cliche there, because I mean that's kind of how we see all of them, right? but but at the same time, it includes enough detail, it's well written enough, and it's funny enough that not only does it get away with it, but the whole speaking with animals thing is really kind of becomes a major aspect of the story in so many ways, including his detection. So Ron, first off, welcome. Secondly, I am a big fan of your t-shirt choice. And third, talk to us a little bit about Domesticated, where it came from, where the character came from. And I know you're working on more stories, or maybe even a collection, if I'm not mistaken, with this protagonist. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure, man. And thanks a lot for choosing my story and thinking it's funny. Just want to let you know, when I got your email saying that you chose it for review number 5, the wife and I were in Cincinnati at dinner. I've been waiting for that email for a while, and I got it, and we proceeded to celebrate and ended up having to spend the night in Cincinnati because I couldn't drive home. But but it was I really appreciate it, man. It's an honor to be. I found you guys on social media and just thought, man, what a cool publication. I'm going to give this a shot. So, but anyway, as far as the story goes, I knew I wanted to write a detective story. Typically I come up with characters first, and I wanted a guy. I've been kind of, I'm a big animal lover. I love dogs, big dog lover. And I knew I wanted a guy. I've been fascinated with people's communication with animals. Because when I was a kid, I remember, watching Dr. Dolittle. So what I did is I created a character who was a kind of a mashup between Die Hard's John McClane and Dr. Dolittle. Only he's Joe's more like John McClane in Die Hard 3. Because I mean he's a mess. But I mean I grew up reading comics. So I like defined heroes and villains in my stories, but I don't like heroes who are perfect. I just, they got to have something wrong with them. They got to have flaws in some way, because I mean, nobody's perfect. And even though they may be some type of hero or the good guy or superhero, and so I knew I wanted him to, have some issues. And I started writing his backstory. This whole thing required a lot of discovery writing about each one of the characters that I put in there, and where I ask a lot of what if questions. So I kind of developed his backstory. He's a former canine cop in Cincinnati that, of course, could communicate with animals, and so he was very successful as a canine officer in Cincinnati. He won canine officer of the year. He was him, and it's because he had the bond that he had with his dog, and because of we don't find out really in this story, but later on I was actually working on a novel for Joe Cooper. Right now I'm 50,000 words in, and we find out that his dog canine partner got killed in a shootout because of a mistake that Joe made. Because of his hubris, he just thought, well, we can do anything, and that doesn't turn out to be the case. But with this particular story here, once I had the character, I knew I also wanted to write a story about PTSD with veterans, and I knew I wanted to be a missing persons case. And I just kind of started at the beginning and kind of pantsed it from start to finish. The humor in it, the jokes, I guess. I used to be a comedian back in the day. I've always had a pretty good way of being able to put humor in my writing. Um, at least, some people tell me that. I laugh at it if nobody else does. But yeah, it just, everything it just kind of worked out, and I fell in love with the character and the story, and I also wanted some character development with Joe as he goes through the story, to where to the end he figures out, okay, yeah, I'm going a way that I need to turn some shit around, and he starts to do that, and so anyway, that's basically it, man. I had a lot of fun writing it. Really excited that you included it in the review number 5, and I'm and to be included with all you guys, because you guys wrote great stories for this review, man. Just blown away by them. Really cool.
Outstanding, man. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that's cool. I mean, and he speaks with quite a few different animals in this, right? We got cats, we got dogs, we got rats, at one point. But actually, while the communication with animals obviously is an integral and kind of unique aspect to the story, his interaction, some of my favorite scenes in this are his interaction when he's interacting with a human,
Right.
in a room where he's also interacting with the animal, but of course the other human has no idea that he's interacting with the animal, and the entire time. And that juxtaposition was a lot of fun for me. So thank you for that.
Well, cool. Awesome. Yeah. I'm a big Twain fan, and so Mark Twain, and so I mean he was kind of a master at being able to put irony in his stories, and I wanted a little bit of that in this, to where maybe the reader knows what's going on, but the characters don't. But yeah, I didn't want him solely just talking with animals throughout this whole thing, because I mean he's a detective, so he can't, he can't, or he's a private investigator. There's a difference. So I've been told that, I guess, the appeal of this character here is that he doesn't just solely rely on talking with animals. He just kind of uses, he deals a lot more with people. He just, he, like you said, there's a line in there where, he doesn't exploit animals, but he definitely, he uses them to help, solve cases. And
well, sure. I mean, in the one scene where and I hope I'm not goofing this up, but I don't think I am. In that one scene where he's discussing with the he essentially makes a deal with the cat to get information from the secretary in the doctor's office. So he and the cat have this one, deal going on, but the lady has no idea about it, and she just thinks he's giving him a cat, and so the whole thing is really kind of clever and fun. So yeah.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, hot Jennifer. Yeah, who turns into bitch Jennifer. Yeah. Yeah, that was a fun scene to write. Socks is actually going to be in the novel as well, so it's pretty cool.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Ron. Appreciate it, man.
Well, thank you, man. I really appreciate this. This is great. Yeah, I'm really excited about this character, and my plan is to get the manuscript done by late spring, and see what I can go from there.
Cool. Very cool. Okay, so let's go to Perry, and Perry, I want to talk about Anthropodermic. I hope I pronounced that correctly. You would certainly know better than I. And in Anthropodermic, one of the things we talked briefly, this is your first fiction publication, but you've published nonfiction in the past, and this is something that you seem to know quite a bit about, if I'm not mistaken. And this, by the way, this quote unquote that I'm talking about are essentially books bound in human skin, right? So Perry, why don't you talk to us a little bit about where the story came from, and also a little bit about your knowledge and expertise in that area.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So there's kind of two places that the story came from, and the first is from my day job. I'm a professor in Western Kansas, and my research has been in early modern books bound in human skin. And I've done a fair amount of looking at these. And actually, the book that we deal with in the short story is kind of a mishmash of 5 or 6 books that I have had the I'm not going to say pleasure because it's a distinctly unsettling experience, but I've had the experience of sitting down with and messing around with and looking at and doing interviews about. Um, and so a lot of the factual knowledge and the doctor that I mentioned in the book is actually a real person who um, dealt in anthropodermic books. And so there's this entire kind of world that I've always wanted to write about because I think it's interesting. And it's interesting in a way that I can't quite describe in an academic article. On the other end of the spectrum, I grew up reading EC comics. I grew up reading a lot of H.P. Lovecraft. I grew up reading, pulp horror in general. And skin-bound books are everywhere and that kind of thing, but they're always kind of prop pieces. So I wanted to do a story that was about one of these books, but actually have it be about it in a real-world historical sense. And I threw these together, and the story just kind of happened. I pantsed it from there. And I've never written a ghost story before. I tend to go more towards weird horror and things like that. But it just kind of happened, and I am thrilled with what happened with it.
Excellent. Excellent. And I mean, the whole so these books that you've looked at in the past, these are circa when? Now, obviously not when you looked at them. I mean when they were created.
So the one that got me started on things was from 1608. It's at the University of Memphis Library, and I was actually writing with a friend of mine um, in University of Memphis because had gone to go see Sun Records, and my friend pointed at the University of Memphis and said, "You know, they have a skin-bound book there." And I said, "Stop the car." Um, and I went and made an appointment to go have a look at it the next month. But all of the other ones and the doctor that I mentioned are all from the 1800s. The skin-bound books were a really big deal in the 19th century and were seen as a prestige item for book collectors.
Gotcha. Okay. That's kind of creepy, but interesting. All right,
Yeah, I can't
cool.
imagine like calling up a bookbinder and being like, "I got a request for you,"
Right.
and thinking this is going to impress all your friends.
Yeah. Yeah. Or, nowadays you'd probably go immediately on some blacklist somewhere.
I wonder sometimes, like what the FBI thinks about my Google searches.
I can imagine. Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you, man. Thank you, Perry. And the story is a lot of fun, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. So I appreciate you being in this, man.
Well, I'm honored to be in it, and especially with the authors that I'm in the book with. I've enjoyed your stories, and I've had a blast reading through it. So, it's a good place to start out, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely, man. And again, congratulations on that being your first fiction publication. That's amazing. That's awesome. So, um, let's go to Robert. Robert J. Binney. He wrote Better Not Cry. And Better Not Cry, I'm going to be honest with you, Better Not Cry was the first story chosen for this collection because I found that I'm reading the story and it was one of the first ones I had read. I'm going to say in the first 5 stories or something that I'd read for it. And like I was talking before, there's always anchor pieces, right? There's a few select pieces that you want to be, I don't know, to just kind of set the stage or what have you. And I figured, first off, we had never done a Christmas or Santa story, even though we do winter issues. Secondly, I think I found myself laughing out loud, like in the first 2 or 3 pages, like a few times. And, even the first line, right, about Santa and pissing on his lap. And so Robert, why don't you tell us a little bit about where it came from, about and what's funny is when I sent Robert the acceptance, he sent me back something saying, "Gosh, I didn't even think this was a funny one." So, so Robert, why don't you talk a little bit about Better Not Cry?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, thanks. And like to echo everybody else, I'm super excited to be accepted and to be in the book. And have my name spelled right is just a treat. So thank you for all of that. Yeah, no, I'm just gobsmacked that people thought it was funny. Yeah, I think of myself, Ron mentioned that, he tries to write funny, and there are times when I think I am funny and try to write funny, and when I force it, I can't, like, I just become a black hole of humor. And just it's really tragic. So this was just I was just writing dark, and I should be working on other things. I have a novel that I've been punting and kicking down, rewriting the first 30,000 words over and over and over and over and over again. And so this was just let me do something on the side so I don't feel guilty about not working, but I'm really not working. And yeah, I thought I was going for dark. I was going for serious. Maybe that's just pretentiousness on my part, but I'm like, there's no fucking joke anywhere in here. And you're like, this is funny. And then I like my wife read it when it came out, and I could hear her laughing in the other room, and I'm like, okay, I just shows you I don't know anything about anything.
That's good. That's good. But so talk about where'd the character come from? Is this the first time you've written about this character?
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this was I'm not a pants guy about anything in life, but I kind of pants my way through this one. And I had that first line like just came to me like, oh, how many kids piss on Santa's lap? And I'm like, that had to be like in the Billy Bob Thornton movie, or there had to be a detective that was also a Santa Claus. Like that had to have been done before. And I asked some writer friends of mine, they all told me about like their Santa stories, but I'm like, no, that's not the. So I just kind of ran with it, and we're just kind of noodling around the idea and like what could be investigating and why, and I don't think I ever actually resolved that. But then I got about a page or two into it, and I was down in coastal Oregon, and this bomb cyclone storm came through, and it was like 15 degrees and ice everywhere, and power went out, and I thought, okay, fine, power's out. I can still watch, the football playoffs on my iPad. And then all the cell towers went down. So no power, no heat, no nothing, no music, no starvations on the radio, just nothing. And I'm like, well, how am I going to entertain myself? And well, I mean, it was too cold for that, so I'm like, well, shit, I'll just light a candle and read and write. And so that's so it just kind of came out of the despair of it's dark. I'm boiling water over an open fire to make instant coffee, and that's my life right now.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. That's been my life a lot recently, weirdly. They keep on turning off our power for seemingly no reason. Thank you, Southern California Edison. Don't get me wrong, I do understand that there are lots of reasons to do it, and I know that we have wildfire issues, all that. But they'll send me an email saying we may turn your power off because of wildfire and extreme wind conditions, and it literally will have like 5 mile an hour wind outside. It's like, guys, and there I am, just like you. I'm boiling water for coffee in the morning, that you have to light. So it's, uh, but yeah, I love things like that where it just comes out of nowhere. But by the way, you guys are killing me here. So this is four references to pantsing. What's going on with pantsing? Talk to me about pantsing.
I mean, people who are more literate than I can probably explain it better. But so, like, there's the whole school of thought of for writers, like, do you outline your story? Do you have note cards? And I've got literally 150 note cards on my whiteboard right here for something else I'm working on. And like, how structured do you put into it, or do you just grip it and rip it and start with that first sentence and see where the hell it goes? And so that's kind of by the seat of your pants. So it's called pantsing. And
Gotcha.
so this was, I don't know where it goes. I don't know when I'll be done. I think I'm going to write until until the lights come back on, and then
Yeah.
we're done.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, no, I get that. And I brought this up on the podcast before, but there are writers that do that. Like Elroy is literally famous for having an outline longer than his actual novel was,
Yeah.
which is absurd in my personal opinion. James Elroy is not absurd, but but that is crazy. But and then James Lee Burke has a quote that they asked him what his process was, and he says, "Well, I start by writing a great sentence, and then I try to follow it up with another one." That is pantsing.
Yeah.
Apparently. So anyways, yeah, there's a big gray area, by the way, in between those, but still, thank you, Robert.
Thank
I
you.
enjoyed the story quite a bit, man.
Thank you.
So let's go over to David. Return of the Grievous Angel. Yet again, probably third one in here. Hybrid Western, non-traditional Western, right? David, you're an accomplished writer in your own right already. And this one, I know that you've done some kind of sci-fi kind of stuff in the past, right? This one is are Westerns something you've done in the past, or is this kind of an outlier for you?
No, I had, let's see, the last book you're probably referring to is the kind of the techno thriller
Yeah.
romance, not NSFW, and the one before that was The Fountain, which was more of a literary satire. But my undergrad, way back in the day, I went to the University of Oklahoma. It was one of the first professional writing programs. Was basically founded on the Pulp Fiction school of writing. Cliffhangers. Every character's got their own what they want, what they need. You just throw rocks at them constantly, and then after a bit of time, I actually moved to Chicago and did theater. I was writing and producing theater for about 16 years, and having that pulp school kind of background was great because that can translate. The story mechanics can translate to any genre or any form. And when you and I connected on Instagram and I started reading your stuff, I was like, all right, man, I had such an affinity for pure pulp back in the day. We talked about like Andrew Vax and reading, Don Wilson or Winslow and just a bunch of that. And I had always wanted to do a Western, especially when the weird Western started to become a thing. It wasn't just a Louis L'Amour, it wasn't, Big Sky. It was, the hybrids. And that really intrigued me. And I actually started a Western play back in the day. I think I got like 30 pages in and then just kind of abandoned it for whatever reason. But then connecting with you and like seeing, the crime fiction and Westerns and then you're talking about hybrids. And I was like, okay, here's an opportunity for me to actually do a Western, with a deadline, which is nice because I have been writing quite a long time, but this year was the first year or last year I'd written short stories. This is the first two short stories I'd written in probably 20 years. And one was an invitation for an anthology, came out in October. And then of course, your deadline and getting the books out, which I got to say, guys, to submit a short story and see it published within a couple of months in book form is insane. Like that is crazy. Back in the day, it used to be, 6 months to a year, 24 months out. You prayed you didn't get the kill feed letter, like, hey, we love your story, but we're not going to print it for whatever reason. Or, we're going to print you, you're going to be published online, which, it's a great place to start, but that, you can't hang that up on your wall. And that's so you guys putting together such a beautiful package is fantastic. But yes, Weird West.
Weird West, absolutely. First off, David, I appreciate the hell out of that. Secondly, you're the first person that's ever mentioned that, and I appreciate it because so here's the good part and bad part about that, right? The good part is we're able to just do this, right? Like we get the stories in. I always wait a couple weeks before I start reading any of them, just because you want a little bit of it. It's not like I can keep up with them coming in, so I always let them kind of sit there for a couple weeks. Keep pushing the submissions, and then I'll start going in, and Jake and I will start looking at them. I'll send stuff off to Jake, and he and I will talk about them. But the fact that the reading period is September, October, we put the book together, or the submission period is August, September. We read them a little bit of August and September, the book is put together in October, it's printed in November, it's out by December, is that's crazy. Like that is so fast. And so we already have, like, for example, the cover for number 6, I already have. Like number 6 is already set up. The whole thing is set up. I just don't know the stories, right? And so that's how we kind of do them because we have to do it that way. So when we do something like screw up David's title, I can't fix it because it's so fast. You know what I mean? Everything is so quick in there that that's just kind of, the way it comes out in the wash. But I mean, I can fix it down the road, but it's, for the first batch or so, it is what it is. But and that's another reason, and I say this in the videos for the submissions, but it really means something, is that I encourage writers, when you send stuff in, make sure your story is solid, because if I read the story and I like it, but I see a bunch of editing errors that need to take care of, we don't have time for it. Like literally, I'm not going to line edit it. I don't get paid for that. So it's up to you at some point to turn it in. Switchblade magazine used to have a thing with where they said, whatever you send us, that's what we print. Right.
Wow.
And so the idea is that, okay, so you need to handle your side of it so that I can read it and I can publish it for you. But I can't, if I see 10 things that need to be fixed, I can't do anything about that. So what I have done in the past is I've said, hey, like this story, there's some issues here. If you want to resubmit for the next issue and fix that, that'd be great. I'd love to look at it again. But I can't, we don't have the time to fix this in 2 weeks kind of thing. And so, yeah, you're right. It is a really quick turnaround, and there's positives and negatives with that for sure. But that's how we chose to roll with it, and I really like it, honestly. So, but yeah, you do run at least the risk of goofing something up along the way for sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, it happens anywhere. There was a formatting error in the one that came out in October as well. So it is what I mean. You spend 2 years on a novel, you spend much less time on a short story. It comes out quicker. But the thing that I've noticed, because I'm in the indie lit world, and I've recently moved over a little bit more into the horror, is seeing you guys consistently putting out work. And a lot of other presses would spend a year doing pre-orders, and you're just like, here's the next book, here's the next book, here's the next book. And because you always have a new cover popping up, I assume you're getting less, unsubscribes. And also people are like, oh, I need to get rolling on possibly for the next submission. If you've got 2 submissions in it, like the fact we just got the book and now you're already like February 1, submissions are open. It's like, oh, there's a momentum there that I think can benefit anybody. Like I said, I wrote full-length plays. I produced. After a devastating loss of a deal out here in Hollywood, I moved back to novels just to keep my sanity. And luckily, I kind of broke through in the small press world. But between writing 80,000 word books, writing short stories, and knowing you have a place to submit, that might take it on, or it might be a quick turnaround, or getting the invitations is really, really satisfying. I mean, I have 2 books on my skin shelf now that, there was no conception of the story, prior to September.
Mm-hmm.
And, and there they are. So I think what you guys are doing is fantastic, especially with your brand building. And I know we had talked, and you talked about, I think, number 4, you've gotten more submissions for number 4 than you had the first 3 combined.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a matter of brand building. So that's really great, and people want to be a part of that. So yeah. I'm glad that was a part of it. I made that, for you guys that don't know, I made the last round on the last one on number 4, but I went too weird west on it, which is understandable. I was like, well, I'm gonna swing for the fences on this one, but
yeah.
But also regarding, okay, so mine's Return to the Grievous Angel. It's about a trio of grifters, a father-daughter, and their buddy, basically, grift a grifter and take his treasure map and follow it, and are stuck out in the plains, digging for this treasure, and shenanigans ensue. And the original idea was that it was going to be something a little bit more biblical that they were going to find, and that the idea that kind of bored me. And then, of course, doing something with the cursed land and industrialization and the railroads and things coming through like that. I didn't want to use any kind of Native American mythology, so I just started looking at different mythology for Irish, German, all the core group of immigrants that had come over. And when I found what I found with the Germanic, I was like, oh my God, I would never in a million years pick this as my original idea. But I want to see where it goes. That's where the pantsing goes. Like, okay, I've got three kind of down to earth, mostly smart people. Like, what are they going to do? And that was fun. And going back to the gentleman that was talking about the having humor, Monty Python was a big influence on me. Not on this story, but The Thing with Kurt Russell, when the spider head goes crawling and you had the guy go, "You gotta be fucking kidding." Like, as a kid, that stuck with that reaction to such a horrific thing. The humor of exasperation is like you can always go to the boss with the incompetent underlings. I always find that funny, no matter what the setup, no matter what the genre. And so, having to kind of exploit, like, what would grounded real humans do in a situation that's kind of absurd is always fun for me to write, and it always leads to something unexpected.
Absolutely, man. Excellent. And yeah, I'm stoked because I went to the Oddities and Curiosities Expo yesterday with my wife and some friends in LA, and I actually got the Thing snapback um, from the Kurt Russell movie, so I was pretty excited about that. Yeah,
Nice.
it's a classic. I mean, let's be honest. He put out, okay, in a span of, I want to say, 5 years, Kurt Russell put out um, The Thing and Big Trouble in Little China and Escape from New York. He essentially put out like a pulp trifecta of perfection.
That would be a career for anybody.
And
That would
5 years
be a
before
career
that, he
for
was the computer who wore
anybody.
tennis shoes. So yeah.
Yeah, no, it's so good. But yeah, the thing is great. All right, man. Thank you so much, David.
Yeah,
Let's go to
thank you.
yeah, absolutely. Let's go to Charles. And Charles wrote stages in this. Charles, it's the shortest story in the book. I think it's what, 5, 6 pages, something like that. And for those that don't know, most of you probably do, but for those that don't know, Charles is the editor and co-founder of Hard Case Crime, which is, you walk into Barnes and Noble, you see Hard Case Crime. You walk into your independent bookstore, you see Hard Case Crime. You walk into your used bookstore, you see Hard Case Crime. Hard Case Crime is everywhere, and Charles has a lot to do with that. Charles has also won an Edgar Award. He's won a Seamus Award. So he's certainly a wonderful writer in his own regard. But we're also talking about publishing, Stephen King and James N. Cain and Max Allan Collins and Donald Westlake and blah blah blah. So, anyways, Charles, and whatever Starlight Pulp is at this point, Hard Case Crime is a 50 times that. And so I want to let you know that we are very much kind of in awe of what you guys have done there. And it's
Don't
certainly
say that. My head's gonna explode. I can't live up to that kind of introduction. But listen, I'll tell you this. Setting aside the story, you can't talk too much about the story because it's so short. It would wipe it out. But I love reading short story magazines and short story collections, anthologies. It's one of my great passions. I grew up on Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine and tons of the old Alfred Hitchcock anthologies with the caricatures of Hitchcock on the cover and so on. But generally, with a few exceptions, when you pick up an anthology or a magazine, there'll be one or two good stories and there'll be one or two bad ones, and mostly it'll be middle of the pack. And what I have to say about your collections, you sent me the first two, or maybe it was two and three, I can't remember, and the new one, of course. And it's very much to your credit, to the credit of all the individual authors, but to you as an editor, one story after another, I love. And that is very rare that you can pick up a collection of 10 or 20 or 15 stories and read them back to back, and one after another, it's good. And that's what you've done, and you've done it repeatedly. So my hat's off to you. I wouldn't have guessed that you weren't an active line editor. I would have guessed that you probably had more of a hand in the crafting of the stories. But now that I know you don't, I have to say, your taste is excellent. I don't mean that as a self-aggrandizing thing to say because I'm in there, but the ones that I'm not in, it's just really satisfying. So my hat's off to you for that, and I'll read each issue. It's just great stuff. And then the story, the thing is, if I'm known for anything, it's crime fiction, and I very rarely get a chance to write anything that's not crime fiction. Once in a while, I'll do science fiction or something like that, but it's very hard to place a story that isn't one of the big three, right? Science fiction, crime, or horror. Uh, if you want to write in the other genres of pulp, back in the day, you had these other categories. You had carny pulp. And the carnies didn't necessarily, I mean, there was usually some crime in there somewhere, but it wasn't necessarily about crime. It was about these people who were living in the sort of lower echelons of society, and they were wandering about, and just what happened to them was interesting. And another category was what I called backstage pulp, right? You were backstage at a theater, and people were leading desperate lives, and you found it interesting. It was fun to read, even if they weren't shooting each other. And I wanted to write a story like that. So Stages is that. It's backstage pulp. It was the germ of it came from two things. One, my daughter, somehow I ended up reading James Joyce's Dubliners to her. And there are a couple of stories in there that are really hard to get through today because they're just too enmeshed in the Irish politics of the time. But most of them are these wonderful stories about disappointment. They're about people who had goals and dreams and ambitions and didn't achieve them. And I thought that's the kind of story that I'd like to write. And then the second thing, so I sat down to write a story about backstage at a theater and somebody who was a star briefly and is no longer and can't do the job anymore and is just getting old. And I thought that would be an interesting character to write about. And then I had to figure out where to put him. And I had to mentally imagine this backstage setting. And of course, the only backstage setting I could think of on the spot was the set of The Muppet Show. And so the story takes place, it's not obvious to anyone but me, but the story takes place in the Muppet Show Theater. And so it's a mashup of James Joyce and the Muppet Show. And what publisher would let me do that? You would. And I'm very grateful for it because I can't, who else could I possibly give this story to? And so it was fun. It was fun to do.
Excellent. Well, yeah, I love the story. We talked about it. Charles, we were going back and forth on email, and Charles said something along the lines of, well, I've got a story, but I'm not sure it's pulpy enough. So, why don't you take a look at it? And I read it and immediately liked it a ton. There's so much without it. It's kind of an elegant story in a way, and those are hard to come by, especially in pulp.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. That's sort of what I was going for. I may never do it again, but I'm glad I got to do it once. And I'd love to do it for you again. It would be really an honor to be in this in your pages again.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate the hell out of that, and all of that praise you threw on us before. I certainly appreciate. So, thank you so much, man. I love that you are a part of this, and the fact that you've been supportive of us and everything is just I'm just going to be honest with you guys. It speaks volumes about Charles because trust me, there are lots of I reach out to people all the time, and I don't hear back more often than I hear back from people, and I'm not. There's no bitterness there at all. It's just you. Charles has been very accessible and very kind where some people are not. So that's Charles, you've been
Well, I'll tell you, thank you for saying that. I'm here, Hard Case Crime is here because some people were kind to me. And it included people who had no reason to be. And so I feel like it's my job to pay that forward. I didn't know Stephen King back in 1995 when I, started thinking of these things, or 2004 when we published our first books. And I just reached out to him and got lucky. And you know, I'm not Stephen King. I wish I could lend as much gravitas and promotional oomph to what you're doing as he did to us. But I do feel like if somebody's been good to you, and there have been a number of those for me, you owe it to the community, and you owe it to the people who love the same kind of writing that you do to try to keep things alive. Somebody's got to do what you're doing, and I'm thrilled that you are. Uh, and I want you to keep doing it.
Absolutely, man. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And read Stages when you get the review, because it is a phenomenal story. But like Charles said, it's so short that you can't give away too much, because you're gonna get the story.
There's practically it is a bite-sized story. It is an amuse-bouche, as they say in the restaurant trade.
Absolutely. Okay, let's go over to Colin. Colin Brightwell is the author of It Felt Like a Kiss. Now, I want to point out that this was one of the other anchor pieces. I want to say this was either the second or third story that was chosen. And there was something about this story the first time I read it where I was like, oh man, the marriage of the. I loved the juxtaposition of the 50s, 60s girl kind of doo-wop bands, and their songs, and the oftentimes very misogynistic lyrics in those songs, even though they're sung by women and hits by women, but they're generally written by men. Correct me if I'm wrong. And and this whole abusive kind of relationship with the one girl in this, and then the guy that comes looking for her. I just thought that was really well done. And so why don't you talk a little bit about the genesis of this, where it came from, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Growing up, my mom and dad had a rule that my sister and I couldn't have electronics or anything except for a radio station at night. And the KC had a really great oldie station, no longer around, unfortunately, but that was my musical education. I heard, the Shangri-Las, everybody was on that, and it was 24/7 for me. And I get older and I'm thinking they're kind of creepy. I mean, it felt the way what David Lynch does to Blue Velvet and all that kind of stuff. Like there's this kind of this underlying eeriness of those songs, even though they're kind of beautiful. And 3 years ago, I had this idea to incorporate this kind of love of girl group songs with a female protagonist, and I wrote the same paragraph 20 times. Didn't get it done. I was like, I fuck it, walk away from it a little bit, and I was riding high off of acceptances from Dark Yonder and Rock and Hard Place, some good pulpy stuff, and I'm like, maybe this is the time to go back to that. And then what it did for me find the right angle was the character Rossi, who's this Nikki's the main character, her old pimp from New York, texting her songs on the phone. I had that image. I was like, that's how we started. That's where we go. And it just kind of took over from there. It had quite a bit of a roller coaster submission cycle. Tough didn't want it. And I was like, okay. Almost got it, Ellery Queen. And I was like, oof, okay. And then, oh, wow, Starlite Pulp. They're open right now. I've been looking at you guys for a while. I'm like, let's go. So what a great way to, I think, close out 2024 again. That story published. I kind of want to do more of this kind of pulp stuff. I'm coming off an MFA program, so I kind of got a little stuffed out of literary fiction, and just this kind of
you got to work that literary fiction out.
Oh
it takes a while.
Yeah. I was doing a lot of Bill Boyle, and I was really liked the way he just, that third person present tense. I was just like, okay. And I try to get my little short, choppier sentences in there, and I thought it kind of clicked. I'm glad I didn't write it 2 years ago, because I don't think it would have been as good. And I'm glad that you liked it. I was kind of worried. I was like, this is going to be, no one's going to like it. No one's going to read it. I thought is it too niche? Is it too, who listens to these groups anymore? But I'm glad that you appreciated the creepiness of the songs. It has that. So
No, absolutely. Yeah. And there's a bunch of them. When you really listen to the lyrics, they're a little creepy. And what's funny is a lot of times there are things you've sung along to, you know, 150 times and barely realized it. And then you really kind of look at them and you're like, that's that's a little creepy. But uh there you did a good job of tying that together, and I liked the protagonist quite a bit.
I
What's
like
her
her
name?
too. Nikki.
Yeah,
Nikki.
Nikki. She's great. Enjoyed her quite a bit. So, uh, and like I said, yeah, this was one where I literally think I read this once, maybe I think once, and then maybe I read a couple of little excerpts again, and was just like, yeah, I gotta find a way to get this in. So, yeah, thanks, Colin. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And now, I think last, actually, let's go to let's go to Frank. Now, Frank has the longest title, without question, in the book. Brutal Love Wears Jackie O Dime Store Sunglasses. And when I read this, I liked it a lot, and it's a little on the lengthier side. And it was so I ran it by Jake because Jake is the associate editor here. And every once in a while, like I said, like I pointed out, I make a decision like right away. I read one, whatever genre it might be. I read one and I'm like, oh God, I got to get this in there, right? But then there are a lot where I'm like, ooh, I like this a lot, but it's really long. Or but I have a question about this. And so I make a big group of those and I send them along to Jake and I say, okay, Jake, let me know what you think of here. And Jake is a fantastic guy to have read him because he is a really, really good editor, gives me fantastic feedback, but he doesn't know any of you guys. So it's not like on Instagram or something like that where he has no clue who any of you guys are. So he just reads them and gives me really solid feedback, and he loved this one as well, and I did too. And we're both like, yeah, it's pretty long, but let's go ahead and throw it in there. And I felt like when I read this that it was very there was a Jim Thompson-esque aspect to this that definitely stuck out to me. Now, obviously, it being in 1969, correct me if I'm wrong, Frank, but 1969, makes it a little different. Obviously, I don't remember any Thompson stuff that late, but so I loved the juxtaposition of this kind of very noirish kind of character. At the same time, you've got the summer of love and the hippie stuff going on, and here we are in Alabama, right?
Yeah.
Which I wouldn't even think of as a bastion of hippiedom, certainly. But regardless, read this, enjoyed it quite a bit. So Frank, talk a little bit on Brutal Love.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, yeah. So the only reason I put it in Alabama was because I based a couple of the characters, friends of mine who were in Alabama. So I could have said it anywhere. But the idea, that story was, it drove me insane for about an entire summer because I had rewatched a lot of Lee Marvin and Angie Dickinson films last spring, and I'm a huge fan of both of them. And I wrote this page of dialogue I ended up putting in the story about three people, nameless people at the time, who are talking about those films. And I just was like, oh, this is trash. And I just put it away. And the story came to me and I wrote it. But I wanted to do a story with a femme fatale kind of character, but I didn't want to set it in the classic way. So I just went for some like hippie, groovy kind of person, and I based it on the way a friend of mine looks, and I'm not a big fan of hippie culture myself, so I have the other character to kind of balance them out of Ray, who's an ex-boxer, and I don't know really where it came from. It's just I'm a fan of all kinds of literature. Like, 1 minute I'm reading hard case crimes. Like one of my favorite books of the year was Nobody's Angel that I read this year, and next minute I'm reading Brad Watson. Right now I'm reading Scott Phillips. So I pull from different things. I don't really have a set idea what I'm gonna do. I don't have outlines. I'll make little notes when I'm done writing for the day at the bottom, but I don't know. I like writing about criminals. I have no interest. Like, I spent my formative younger years running from cops, so I don't want to really write about cops and private investigators and things. I'm very intrigued by because I don't view them as bad people ever. Because I grew up in a neighborhood where working class people were petty thieves, you know. So these are the types of people I'm interested to write about.
Yeah, and I think we've maybe even touched on this before, Frank, you and I. But Elmore Leonard always said that uh, somebody asked him, how do you write about terrible people and make them so human? And his response was, to me, every single one of my characters, good, bad, indifferent, or anything between, is only looking to be happy. So if you look at it from that perspective, they're just looking for their happiness. That's all there is to it. You can look at them from the outside and say, oh, they're a terrible human being because they didn't get their GED and they've been in juvie and they did this and they did that and they did this and now they rob people. But this guy is just trying to make it work for him. That's it. That's all I have to relate. And that really struck me at the time because I'm like, oh God, that's a great way to look at it, right? So and by the way, Frank, I love the Dillinger portrait behind you.
Yeah, I still don't know who sent me that for Christmas. I got an idea, but someone just sent it to me, and I'm like, well, this is fucking cool, man. This is like mugshot or something. I don't know.
Very cool.
But yeah, I don't know. It was just a great thing to be in. I think we talk a lot online, and I just was just like, dude, what the fuck? You know, it was just like, it was so hard for me to write because I kept going back to it and I kept stopping with it and going, and I'm like, but you know, something draws you in, and it is one of the longer stories, but I cut out about 5,000 words from that story to make it fit because I broke it up into 3 parts. You know, that was more from myself. You know, so I didn't get lost too much in it, but I really enjoyed those characters and that time in there. And I've read most of the stories so far in the review, and I really like them all. And I really do think you're all doing a good thing. Like, you know, because I've been at this 20 years, but of course, 15 of those were as a poet, you know. So I've seen so many magazines come and go, and I'm glad that you guys are sticking around and doing the right thing out there. So I try to throw your name out there a lot.
Yeah, no, I recognize that too, and I appreciate it. I mean, we all do here, all 5 of us. And so yeah, I mean that's cool. And this is I think, Frank, this is the first time you've submitted, yeah?
Yeah, it seems every time you have a call, I'm working at like a submissions call, I'm working on something else because you know I do columns and things of that nature too, and I'm like, well, what the shit? Like I can't put together a story in 2 weeks, like so, you know, yeah, it was the first time. I'll try again. I don't know if I'll get there in February, but I'll try again.
Sure. And one of the things I liked about these characters a lot, and this is what I mean when I say Thompson-esque, is there's a best way to put it, there's a kind of a brutal realism of it. Like there's no romanticizing of what this is, and
Yeah.
and that's a very Thompson thing, right? Like Chandler wrote about the nitty gritty, but he romanticized the hell out of it, right? And I like that. Don't get me wrong. I'm good with that, just like I'm good with the other side. But Thompson kind of was almost aggressive in his how little regard he had for his characters and sometimes his readers. And that was the feeling I got from this story because it does take some twists and turns. I certainly don't want to ruin anything from the story, but it is very unsympathetic. Let's put that.
Yeah, I don't like I do like Chandler and Hammett and those guys, but for me my favorite ones are Thompson, Charles Williford, Patricia Highsmith. Those are the people that I admired the most from that kind of writing. And yeah, I don't it's just about like those people are just fucking each other over left and right. Sorry for cussing on here. But that's what they're doing. They don't It's an end game and no one really knows it's an end game. I don't want to give it away, but you know, It's just I wanted to end it the way I did, and I didn't know what was going to happen to everybody till I got there. I didn't have an outline. I just little notes I might want to do, like, you might think about this, Frank. You might think about this, and I usually end up ignoring them too. But I don't know what's going to happen till I get there, and I don't have sympathy for. I mean, I know what the world's like in my world, so I try to write from that perspective, I suppose.
Sure. Okay. Well, good, man. Thanks. Um, so I think there's what I think 10 of you guys here, 10 or 11, out of the 14 authors. So that's pretty excellent. We're missing Andrew Miller, who wrote Red Swarm. Excellent story. Andrew just had Namaste Mark Confidential come out this past year, and it's been shortlisted for a couple of awards. So certainly hope he gets somewhere in those. And then we had The Recluse by Karen Harrington, which I loved as a story. It was one of those that I read and I immediately went, okay, yeah, this is excellent. I think I need to do this. But it made me think, because it was here we are in issue number 5. It's the first story we've ever had that had an author as protagonist, which guys like, Stephen King do all the time and things like that. But from a pulp perspective, you don't see it a whole lot, sometimes in horror, but not in other genres. And so so that one was a lot of fun for me, and we obviously did publish it, and so that's the first there. And then Jailbait Birthday by Paige Johnson, who's also one of the co-founders of Outcast Press. She's not here today either, but that one's in here, and that one's a blast. It's a real kind of pulp punch to the face. So yeah. So I appreciate you guys, and so at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open it up a little bit. And we've been through everybody's stories. So if anybody has any questions about us, about Starlite, about the editing process, but more than that, if you have comments to other authors, things you want to talk about with the story, questions you have, comments, anything like that, now is the time to do that. So is there, first off, before I just make it helter skelter, is there anybody in particular with a question or comment that they want to make?
I would love to say one thing first, just the one thing in my mind. I have to apologize for being a horrible reader, because just given where my life is and what I'm doing, I don't get a ton of time to read. I try to get little bits in here and there. And unfortunately, my copy of this book is not with me right now. I'm lending it to a colleague. Every time that I get an opportunity, I'll be like, hey, friends, family, like, please try this, whatever. Buy your own copy, I'll sign it. But I do want you to read at least my story before you give it back. So I only managed to get through the first story, which, Robert, I believe that was yours. I will read everything else. I'm so sorry. I'm totally putting a target on my own back by saying this out loud. But
well, honestly, you've read the most important thing, so I mean, you're done as far as I know.
First and last,
Yeah. I mean, come on.
So I'm very much looking forward to everything else. But what I can say, just having read it, once I became a dad, I started crying at really simple, like, kid-related stuff. There's an episode of Bluey, Sleepy Time, that makes me sob every freaking time. And my son will be like, "Hi, Daddy, what's going on?" I'm like, "It's just beautiful." So I have to say, I agree. I think that your story was funny. And then somewhere on the left-hand page towards the top, that paragraph, I was at work when it gut punched me. How could you? Thank you.
Don't fuck off at work, Eric. I mean, what can I tell you? I mean, I don't know.
I was on break. No, thank you. That's it. That's sorry.
Thank you. Wow, thank you. Well, I just want to echo David's comment. I think it was David mentioned just the physical, the tactile, like that you put out just great looking product, Brian. And I'm a physical media kind of guy. Like, I don't care that the Starvations are coming out on streaming. I don't know how to stream music, but I will go looking for their record now. And so the fact that, like, you're putting out like books and they're perfect bound and like you can touch them and there's paper and they look good and you put some thought into the art and the design, 10 out of 10. Now, of course, Charles wins because he gets the Robert McGinnis covers, but I mean, I'm not in his books. I'm in yours. So, they look really good.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And we do this whole thing, it's kind of funny because thinking back in our lifetimes, I mean, we're all kind of relatively somewhat of the same age, probably 10 years difference at top or something, but we're all kind of, relatively in there. And it's hilarious to me that, we sit here and go, like, I publish books, physical books, and that's kind of seen as like punk rock. Like, like what? Like because we don't make ebooks. We hold the rights and things like that, but we haven't put them out because I'm not a big fan of ebooks, and I kind of want to make it so people have to get the books. Like that's kind of the thing with, I'm a huge book lover, and don't and the other thing I would love to do, which I've talked to Charles about in the past, is make audiobooks. The thing about audiobooks is that any audiobook, okay, I can go read all of these stories. I can read everybody's stories on here. I'm not going to do that, mind you. You should probably do that. But I can read everybody's stories on here and make a review and put it on YouTube, and that would be fine. But in order to get it on a audiobook platform, they have very, very strict requirements. You essentially need studio time, an engineer, a producer, and a reader. Now, if you can read them yourself, I don't necessarily recommend that, but if you can read them yourself, that obviously saves some money. But for one book, you're looking at least $3,000, up to five,
Yeah.
for one audiobook. So
If you want to, yeah.
So as much as I would love to do audiobooks because I like audiobooks, we can't afford them. So it just becomes a matter of we just straight put out books and people buy them or they don't, and they read them, and hopefully they come across them, and people are like, oh, your label's so punk rock, it's like old school, you just make books, and it's like, I guess, but I'm not sure that was the intent per se, but it just kind of is what it is. But
Don't farm it out to Perry. That's my recommendation. Don't let him make your books for you.
right. And so, but yes, we do. And another thing that we've made kind of important since the get-go, that you commented on is, and obviously Charles does this as well, is that book covers are very important to me. They always have been. I spent an unbelievable amount of time in bookstores when I was a kid because my dad was a serious bibliophile. He was an artist, and I would literally go to bookstores in Westwood, and it'd be like, okay, Dad is looking in the philosophy section for the next hour and a half. I have time to kill. And so I'm walking around the bookstore. You know which books I picked up? The ones I like the covers of. I'm 10 years old, right? I mean, that's what you do. That whole adage of don't judge a book by its cover. It's like, are you kidding me? So yes, we take our book cover seriously because bad covers are like a travesty, And obviously Hardcase has some of the best covers in the biz, for sure. And I'm hoping that we do too. But the point is that we do a lot of thinking about that, and we've been very fortunate to couple with some artists. Well, first off, let me just say, honestly, I'm a little bit proud of this one only because this is my dad's. Okay.
Oh,
This painting. It says, if you notice, cover image by Tim Townsley. My dad was a gallery artist for 30, 40 years, whatever. I have like literally no joke. I have like 170 of his paintings. I'm the executor of his estate, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, you can go to timtownsley.com. You can go ahead and take a look at he was a phenomenal artist. And so this is the first one we've used. We've used Danny Galliotti in the past. We use Jens Oklich, who's a phenomenal SoCal car photographer, on a couple of Sonny Haynes books. We're going to use some more of his, but we've been able to couple with some of those people, just like Charles has, right? With Hardcase, where he has a couple of artists that he works with, and so that's been a really good thing. And Charles, if you want to piggyback on any of this, please. But
sure. We're always trying to find painters who work in the old traditional media, and it's very hard to find now. Which isn't to say that people don't do good work digitally. I think some of the digital artists out there are terrific, and we use them on our comic book covers, but we generally try not to for novels. I remember having a conversation with Michael Kelch, who did the wonderful cover for Jonathan Letham's book Gun with Occasional Music, which is how I first found him. And I got excited about working with him, and he did a terrific Westlake cover for us called Somebody Owes Me Money, and then he did The Cane, Cocktail Waitress. And when I was talking to him, he works traditionally, he paints traditionally, but he said what he does is he paints traditionally, and then he scans it and starts modifying it digitally. And I don't think I ever threatened any artist before or since, but I remember saying to him, if you scan this and clean it up, I'll break your arm. And he said, but what if there's a hair from the paintbrush, a bristle from the paintbrush that gets stuck in the paint? I said, I'll pay you extra if there's a bristle from the paintbrush that gets stuck in the paint, because that's what I want. I want that tactile feeling.
Absolutely.
And the new generation isn't being taught anatomy in the same way. You
Right.
see some beautiful skin, but you can't see the bones under the skin in the way that you could when people understood how parts of the body were connected to each other, because that was part of the education. And it's hard. I think there are more writers who are working in the old style than there are painters working in the old style. But there are some. There's a young guy named Irvin Rodriguez who has been doing comic book covers. He's very talented, and I was very excited to get him to do. We're doing this has been announced. It's not a spoiler. We're doing a sequel to the Maltese Falcon, written by Max Allan Collins, called Return of the Maltese Falcon. And by the way, it's not The Return. It's just Return. And I have to remember that because I'm going to get it wrong. But Irvin did the cover for that, and I wish I could show it to you now, but it'll be up on our site probably in the next couple of months, and it's just gorgeous. And he's I don't know, maybe he's in his 30s, but I think he's in his 20s. And I love that there's a young painter who paints like the old masters. It makes me very happy. Bob McGinnis is still around, and we talk once in a while, but he's coming up on his 99th birthday, and he's not painting anymore. So we have to fill in the next generation. They've got to come from somewhere.
Yeah,
but I do love your covers.
And we use Danny Gagliotti, who was on 2, 3, and 4, the reviews, and he does the real painting. And then we have Ryan here and he does digital art because that's what his degree is in from Otis. And I like that quite a bit too. I keep getting on him to make a cover, but it hasn't happened yet. So we keep using him from other places. But anybody else? Any questions, comments, concerns, author stuff? Yes, Ron.
Yeah, I want to say something to Robert about your story. Better not cry. I'm a huge fan. Other than humor and mystery, I love vigilante justice, and I finished a vigilante justice short that I'm going to start sending out. But when your main character tracks down that kid's dad and beats the hell out of him, that made me quite happy. I was like, yes, kick his ass. But yeah, that was awesome, man. Really like that one.
Thank you.
I like the fact that he has to take a day off from his mall Santa job to go do it.
Yeah.
I know for me, because we're talking about, we're roughly the same age and stuff. What's been really interesting, especially working with my publisher, Whiskey Tit, I always try to go to all the book festivals she goes to, and and really get familiar with the community, and actually see who's the faces behind people that are saying yes and no and what they're doing, is the explosion of novellas. Because when I was coming up, it was do not write a novella, nobody will publish it. There's nowhere to do it. And novellas at book festivals are cheap. You get a cool cover. You can buy 2 novellas as opposed to 1 novel. I see people walking around with stacks of them. I've seen them sell out quicker than novels. And it's kind of like, how many stories can I get for the $50 I've got on me? So it has been amazing. Of course, and now every short story I write, I'm like, oh, how do I make this a novella? How can, rein it in, but it's been really interesting to see that, and actually discover a lot of new authors that way, because it's not just a short story. We know short stories can be a one-off, but like a novella, to see how somebody handles that. But I never thought in my lifetime I would see the novella actually become like a legitimate, I would say art form. But even the big 5, depending on the publisher, are putting out novellas now. And it used to be the reason they didn't was because you couldn't see the spine, you couldn't see the name, and they couldn't shelve them, right? But that has been really interesting to see. People, my grandma was a reader, so if the book was less than 300 pages, she wouldn't read it. because if you didn't have anything to say more than that, she wouldn't buy it. But now it seems like we've gone the other way. People are like, I've got a limited amount of reading time. I want to read smaller, punchier stories.
Yeah. I mean, just to piggyback on that, yes, novellas are very, very, very hard to publish, or have been for a long time. We just put out that book of novellas in October, and I'm really happy with that. I like it a lot. I was able to write a Western for that. Frank, I know you've been reading that a little bit. Jean Paul from Space Cowboy Books, he wrote Western in that. Manny Torres has Atlanta gritty crime fiction in that. But the point is that I love novellas. God, I love novellas, but they're hard. They don't fit anything. So, for example, okay, I'm looking at awards, okay, because it's the end of the year, and so we have to submit to Sci-Fi Fantasy Awards, to the Otto Penzler Mystery Awards, to the other Best Mystery Awards, and then there's what's called the Spurs. Okay, the Spurs are for Western stories. The Spurs have very, very, very specific guidelines. There's no novella category. Short fiction, 10,000 words or less. Full traditional novel. Full contemporary novel. There's nothing there.
That's shocking. I'm shocked by that. There's so many categories that, longer fiction, novella length, short story, flash, micro.
Yeah. So it's tough. It's just, from and there's some other stuff I can get to later, but it's interesting. You don't want to get things disqualified just not before they even get read. You know what I mean?
Right.
But so it's an interesting game out there you have to play as a publisher, because then you take your author hat off, and then you have to put on your publisher hat, and you try to find the best fits for these things. But one of the things about publishing things like hybrids and things like that, it's hard. I mean, they don't want that. They want, traditional, this is the best detective fiction of the year. Well, this is the detective that speaks to animals. That, they might not recognize that the same way. They're very traditional in the way that they look at what fits into what categories. And so that part is interesting. That's been a little bit of an education, because I'm learning on the go, just like Jake is, just like, we all are. And I'm getting more involved in it, and I'm getting better at it. But it's, like I said, it's interesting because there's in our writing and plotting and characterization and everything else, there's so much gray area. And with these things, there's none. Like, there's no gray area. It either fits in this or it doesn't, and you can submit it or you can't. And it's interesting in that sense. But anybody else?
Well, likewise, just piggybacking off of that, I just threw this in the anthology or review number 5 in for an anthology award for a crime, and it came back. They threw it back at me and said, "Yeah, there's too much Western in here." I'm like,
exactly.
Dylan went electric, for fuck's sake. I mean,
yeah, exactly. That's the whole point. And so, and that's exactly what I'm talking about, Robert. It's there are some things that are just very standard and traditional, and I'm not knocking it. That's fine. That's who they've been for a long time. It's just that when you're doing something like we're doing, where we're publishing from all different genres, it does make it difficult, because when you submit to these things, these people want comp copies of your lit mag, but then they read 3 stories in and there's a Western, and they're like, well, this isn't crime fiction, so you're like, just wait a minute, you know what I mean? And so it's a learning journey for sure. We're figuring it out, and we got better with it this year. I'll explain that a little bit later, but we got better with it this year. But and we'll continue to evolve with it. But it's tricky, because they want one thing. They want one thing, and we don't do one thing. So, that is what it is.
I have a point. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
All right. First of all, I want to say on Westerns, like probably 90% of them anyways are crime stories. I think so. They just wear different clothes, different time. And I would like to comment on novellas. Like a lot of these novels, like I started reading a guy, I could pronounce his name wrong this year, John Patrick Manchette. And like this book here, Fatal, was really good. And it's only 90 pages, but it's considered a novel. And I've got a lot of books like that. More recently, Jonathan Ames, I think he did You Were Never Really Here, which is a very short book, and it was made into that Joaquin Phoenix movie where he plays a hitman. And a lot of Jim Harrison books I have are novellas in a large novel. Like it looks like a novel. So I think it's kind of like stupid because I have a lot of books that are told as novels, but they're novellas.
Oh, okay. So yeah, so Frank, so looking back in the okay, you look over the John Steinbeck catalog. I've got maybe 5 or 6 of his back there. Almost every one would be a novella. Almost every one. They're all like between like 95 and 120 pages. Those are novellas. You send that to a big five publisher these days, they'll laugh at you. That's not a book. That's a novella. But they were all books at the time. You know, Cannery Row is like 118 pages or something like that. It's tiny, and but they're not considered novellas. They're considered novels. But nowadays they would be considered novellas if they were published. And so that's kind of the thing, right? Is that I don't think that every book that gets published needs to be 350 pages long. Unlike sorry, I forgot who it was, but somebody's grandma on here. But
My grandma.
but you know, a 110 page book to me, I mean, you mentioned Harrison. Some of the Harrison novellas are literally some of my favorite things I've ever read. I mean, Revenge is like one of my favorite stories ever. And it's in front of Legends of the Fall and behind whatever in that collection of novellas. And that's why we put out the collection of novellas again, because if we put them out individually, that becomes a pain and it becomes a spine issue and it becomes all those things. But if we put out a collection of 4 novellas, then all of a sudden, you know, you got 4 individual, almost full, you know, novel length, not quite, but almost novel length stories that people can kind of, you know, rip into. And yeah. So anyways, anyone else? I'm talking.
I just wanted to just share. I've noticed a lot of the stories published by Starlite Pulp, 1 through 5. You know, there's plenty of historically set stories, and it's always interesting to me to see the way different authors manage achieving like a flavor of historicity in their writing. You know, some people write very stylized dialogue. Other people assume kind of like a historical voice throughout the entire story. And one thing that I read, and I haven't read every story in this one yet, but with Necropolis, what I loved about it is that it's set in ancient Rome, as we were talking about, but you do feel the historical setting of it, yet it has this the dialogue. If you read the dialogue, it's very street tough dialogue, and it does that without taking you out of the ancient Roman historical setting. And I think that's a really impressive accomplishment. It's an anachronism, but it works very, very well in the context of the story. And I've read, you know, historical stories where sometimes the dialogue takes you out. Sometimes the dialogue is the thing, you know, like Deadwood is a good example of that. But it's not period accurate, but it's important. But anyways, I just wanted to say that I thought it was a really I read the story and I was immersed in it, but then I went back and looked at the dialogue and I'm like, oh wow, this is not, you know, that sort of the pan-historic Shakespearean voice that is often utilized to give, you know, to tell a historic setting. So, you know, cheers to you.
Thanks, Connor. Appreciate that.
Yeah, you know, one thing I want to add to that, it's so interesting because I was right around the time I was deciding to publish Necropolis, and that's one of the things I liked about it as well, right? Was this kind of not modern language per se, but definitely not, you know, of that era, and I appreciated that. And there's a book Oh man, I don't want to screw it up. I hope I don't. I was just looking for it on my bookshelf and I don't see it, so it's probably in that one or downstairs or over here, whatever. But I don't know. But it's by a guy named I think his name is Wells Tower. I could be wrong, okay? But he wrote this collection of short stories called Everything Ravaged, Everything Burned. And the title of the collection is the last story in it. And the last story in it is a Viking story. Okay, it's a Viking story from beginning to end, and it's the longest story in the collection, if I remember correctly. But it's all written in like modern language, like Necropolis was, and it's fantastic. It is so good, and this actually Necropolis reminded me just a tiny bit of it, and it and to juxtapose this even more, I just got an email at that time in I want to say October from a gentleman, a very conscientious, very kind gentleman who and we've corresponded a few times, but he sent me a very long email complimenting me on the two Sonny Haynes novels, which he had read, uh, Trunk Full of Zeros and then Outlaw Ballads, and then an absolute litany of everything that was wrong with them. And 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 I mean it was crazy. It was this long on the computer. And some of them were very, very legitimate things, right? Very, very legitimate things. Like for example, I referred at one point in 1951 to a Jeep, and a Jeep wasn't a Jeep at that time, it was a Willie. Okay. So that kind of thing, 100%, you're totally right, my bad. But then he also said that you have to remember that when you use terms that are not of that era, it takes us out of that time, Connor, like you were just mentioning, and makes it removes us from the 1950s you're trying to put us in. And I very respectfully, I think, disagreed and said, look, I try to maintain that feeling as best I can, but I'm not going to limit myself to just looking up. And don't get me wrong, I do a lot of research for those things, but I'm not going to limit myself to only a word and I use the example of, okay, look, if I write a book in 1868, you don't want me to write that book in 1868 language. Like, I'm going to lose two-thirds of readers one paragraph into the book. Like that's not necessarily something that I want to do. So you have to allow a little bit of creative kind of expression in certain areas while still maintaining that, kind of aura of where we are. And he respectfully disagreed. But but regardless, and again, he was very nice about it. And the fact that he read both books and gave me that feedback and spent the time to do that, I appreciate the hell out of. Okay, it's not in any way a bitch. It's just this is somebody that took that time, and yet Connor and Chris, I'm agreeing with you in this, in that you want to keep the reader in that period for sure, but at the same time, you don't want to limit yourself to writing in, if I'm going to write a Victorian era novel and I tried to write like Jane Austen, it would go very poorly. And so, you have to maintain your own voice at the same time, if you know what I mean.
There's a great George Lucas, and I can't believe I'm quoting George Lucas, but I remember him going over some special effects, and they're like, well, that's not the correct physics, but romantically it's correct. And I've always kept that in my head. Romantically, it's correct. It keeps the story going. It gives a little bit of, a little heightened realism or whatever. But I've always thought that's like the Jeep thing was, what year it came out or anything like that. It's like, oh, it's romantically correct. And somebody is reading this to be swept up into a world and taken on a journey. So yeah, you can get a little hung up on that for sure. But that's one of those little things that always in my head is like, romantically, that's correct. Keep going,
I think it's an interesting line to walk, because like my sister has studied ancient languages, studied Latin, all that stuff, and one thing I've gathered from her and also whatever I've experienced, street talk has always been street talk. So if you're gonna have someone in ancient Rome be like, "Hey, you, what are you doing in my toif?" Like whatever, like they would have, they would have said it in their language, but they would have. And in writing something that is of the era, like the book that I'm working on is set in 1942, so I had to research. I was like, wait a second, how would they have spelled blender? Wearing blender was with an O. It has to be blendor. So I would do that. But would I write today as to dash day? No, because like I don't. The reader doesn't need to see that. So
Mhm.
I again apologize. I haven't read Necropolis yet, but I 100% on your side with that as well. Like I don't care. You're already being factually incorrect because you're not writing it in the language they would have spoken. But so I
Right.
don't care.
Yeah, and you know, like I was just working on a scene the other day. I'm writing this novel right now in 1953, the next Sonny Hayes novel. It's called Under a Black Flag, and it hopefully will be out late next year. But I was writing the scene, and Katie's talking to Sonny, and she calls him at one point they're talking about something in the car, and she's like, "You're so lame," and I had to look it up. I'm like, "Wait a minute, would they use lame in the 1950s? Probably not." And then I looked it up, and they totally did. That was still a term. Lame was still a term. So I'm like, sweet, okay, I can use that one. But it's one of those things you're constantly doing research and trying to find stuff out. But at the same time, sometimes if something's a little bit more convenient than another, like originally this book I have was set in 1952. Well, in 1952, the White Sox were in Palm Springs for Jesus, what's it called? Spring training. They were in Palm Springs for spring training, and they had these funny little uniforms, which I did my little drawing of and in the notebook and everything to remind myself. But in 1953, where this next book is set, they didn't. But I don't care. I'm still going to write it as if they did because because I missed my 1952 window with Outlaw Ballad. So now I got to take on 1953. So I'm going to use it anyway. And it's one of those things where it's like, you want to be historically accurate, but at the same time, I'm not writing historical fiction. There's a
Hmm.
difference, right? I'm writing fiction and I'm including things in it that I think will work. But it doesn't necessarily mean I'm looking to be 100% factually accurate on everything I'm mentioning. It's fiction, right? So it's and like Eric said, it's a fine line because if you just go completely overboard with it, obviously you can end up somewhere you don't want to be. But it is interesting nonetheless.
I
I think
once
it's
got a
it's down to
very
consistency. I'm sorry, go ahead, David.
uh, I once got a very friendly and funny note. I was lucky to fortunate to have AC Wise looked at first chunk of my new book that's gonna be coming out. Who said it's a biblical horror New Testament kind of thing. And I had a goat chomping on an orange carrot, and she went, "Orange carrots weren't around then." And she goes, "I don't know. Remember where I heard it? Whatever." She wasn't being a jerk about it, but she was just like, she'd remember some factoid, whatever. And I looked it up, and I was like, "Oh yeah, I guess the Dutch invented the orange carrots by breeding, by cross-pollinating the white ones and the red ones." And so, I removed orange, just kept the word carrot. But yeah, there's so much in it. Like I would never in a million years looked up to see if orange carrots were a thing back then.
Right.
I
Right.
just I just wouldn't have, But I'm glad she pointed it out because now
Yeah,
nobody else would
exactly.
point
And
it
that's
out.
what I was telling this guy too. It's like, look, the fact that you mentioned all this stuff and looked it all up and know this, that's fantastic. I appreciate the hell out of that. But at the same time, I'm not always trying to be perfect with that, right? I mean,
Right.
so yeah, Robert, you were saying?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think it's down to like the consistency of the rules of the game. Like whatever you set out for yourself, this is how this book is going to work. It's going
Oh
to
yeah,
work. So
yeah,
like
yeah.
if the Beatles are going to watch Mork and Mindy in their hotel room, like you got to run with it. Like the Beatles had 1970s television and like it's obviously not right, but if you're going to make the mistake, lean into it or then yeah, you run that risk that Eric said of like having them to have to speak
Yeah.
their truth in their language and nobody wants
Yeah.
to read that. At least I don't.
Yeah, I would I would just say that I do enjoy the director. I haven't seen Nosferatu yet, but Robert Eggers does these historical films well in that he seems to really lean in and say, you know what, the mindset of people in this period is largely incomprehensible or
Right.
terrifying to a modern person, and that kind of becomes more like a thematic content. But I do like it when sometimes these creators lean in very very close and try engage psychologically what was it like to be there at that period. But I agree with everyone else. It's sort of it's just a matter of peppering in the right details and then playing by the rules that you set up for yourself as well. I thought that was a good way to put it.
Yeah, I like that as well, actually. Like you said, yeah, because again, look, none of us want to fuck up something that's like basic, right? Like I wrote a story a while back, goofed it up. Oh well, I thought the story was solid, but I used an M16 in it, and it was a good 8 years before M16s were used. Well, that's unfortunate. That's something I should have looked up, should have known it, got it. But at the same time, you want to stay true to what it is you're trying to get across to, right? Like we've all seen things that are not necessarily factually accurate, and they're a lot of fun. And that's essentially what it's all about. We're all fiction writers. Like I said, and that's what I was trying to point out to this guy is like, first off, I'm not trying to write something in that period per se, but secondly, it's not even historical fiction. It's just fiction, right? So
Right.
I can kind of make up whatever the hell I want in this, but I'm still going to try to play by, the rules we would think of in 1951 or 2 or whatever. But there, as a writer, you have to have the ability to manipulate that and change it when you want, right? I mean, sci-fi does it constantly. Sci-fi doesn't have, in fact, in sci-fi, you can almost do anything you want because there are almost no rules. Because in sci-fi, you can write about technology that hasn't even existed yet, but you can also just take technology that already exists and change that too by saying, well, we're in the future, so they've changed it, and then do that too. So you can kind of do anything you want in sci-fi. So they kind of have that license, you know what I mean? So yeah. Chris and Charles are out. So obviously awesome to have them. Anybody at this point?
I just want to say thanks again for including me. I can't wait to finish up everybody's stories. I'm like Brian, also now found myself editing an anthology, so I'm been deadlines before the end of the year. So I'm looking forward to actually having February is going to be my downtime to read my stuff. So I'm looking forward to reading the reviews and everything. Congratulations to everybody that was the first timer. Congratulations to everybody that's still rolling. Brian and his gang's put together a great package, and it's the merch is awesome as well.
Excellent. Thank you.
I'm out.
Okay.
I'm gonna Zoom with another cover artist, so I'm out.
Excellent. Thanks, David. I'm gonna stop the recording, and then you guys can hang out if you want. Everybody else, thank you so much for coming by. Appreciate you. And Starlite Pulp review number 5. Pick it up. These guys are awesome.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
In this topsy-turvy